Welcome back, 8th graders and any learners joining us. Today we're going to continue our conversation looking at Canada. In particular, we're going to look at the Canadians today. So today's video lecture screencast is going to talk a little bit more about population as well as cultural geography. So kind of looking at our learning objectives for today, we're going to identify and explain some of the cultural aspects of Canada. And in particular, I want to look at population, history, government, sports, and food. And Canada is well known for some of its cuisine. So hopefully that will be either a little bit of review or a little bit of learning going on when it comes to the culture of Canada. We're also going to explain the cultural diversity of Canada. We're going to look at religion. We'll also look at the ethnic groups that make up the great nation of Canada. So looking at that population, here are some key numbers that we're going to focus in on. The population of Canada is somewhere around 33 and 6.67 million people. So Canada is a large nation that is not densely populated, because when we compare that population density as well as the overall population of the United States, we're going to have relatively smaller numbers. The population of the U.S. is somewhere around 320 million. And again, here in 2020, we will have a new census that will help us update that and give us a more even up-to-date number. The population density, which reminder, is always measured in people per square mile or per square kilometer. So in Canada, it's averages out to about 9 to 10 people per square kilometer, which means that in comparison to the United States, it's much less densely populated, because in the United States, that average is about 84. When it comes to urban centers in Canada, our three largest cities are Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, respectively. Shifting gears a little bit to Canada's history, Canada and the United States do share some common overlap as well as European influence. So looking at certainly the time period before that European influence in Canada, the Inuit and the native people have been in Canada for thousands of years, and they are very important to the overall history as well as the culture of Canada. However, in around 1000 CE or AD, however you prefer to use your years measured, the Vikings explored this territory, and so we could certainly get into some stories with Leif Erikson. Highly encourage you to check out this link. There's a cool description, and actually it talks about a place that you can go to visit to see how life might have been like for the Vikings living in Canada. When we get into the 16th and 17th century, so we're talking about the 15 to the 1600s, this is where Canada experienced a little bit more of its European influence. And we're going to see that certainly the native, along with the Vikings and the Europeans, continue to have an influence on the culture of Canada today. But this was around the time, so the 1500s, 1600s, when the British and the French began to claim areas in Canada, and certainly places like New France were created along the Great Lakes as well as the St. Lawrence River. So kind of looking at a map, and feel free to follow the link here, and I will include the link to the presentation in the description below. France had been fighting with Great Britain in what is now the United States and Canada in the late 18th century, so primarily in the 1760s. And in 1763, we have the end of what's called the 7 Years' War, or sometimes in the United States we refer to it as the French and Indian War. And France ended up losing this war to Britain and ceded a lot of its land in the United States as well as parts of Canada. And so this became certainly an era or a time period where British influence was great, but we'll see that both the French and the English certainly have a tremendous influence on Canadian culture today. So looking at kind of that transition, Canada for a long time was a colony of Great Britain, and in 1867 it did become one nation known as the Dominion of Canada. And it had its own government, but Canada was still under the control of Britain in the sense that it controlled its relationships with other nations. So essentially, Canada was left to run itself, but any of its experience on the global stage was still controlled by Great Britain. Now, on July 1st, This is what Canadians refer to as Canada Day, which celebrates its birth. It didn't become completely sovereign until it patriated in 1982. And so through an act agreed upon between the British and the Canadians, Canada became independent in 1982. And today the British Queen Elizabeth, still reigns, but doesn't have any real power. And certainly Canada would be much more in charge of its overall destiny. Looking at that same government today, Britain is a great example of a parliamentary democracy. And this is a great example of how the British were able to influence and leave their influence in Canada. And in this sort of government, or in this type of government, the head of the government is known as the Prime Minister. And then you also have legislative branches known as the Parliament. Today, Justin Trudeau is the current Prime Minister, and he did win election in November of 2015, and most recently in November of 2019. And you can see in the presentation here, there's a photo of Prime Minister Trudeau along with his wife, Sophie. And he does come from a line of politicians in Canada. In fact, he's the first son of a former prime minister, and he is a part of the Liberal Party in Canada. I highly encourage you to follow the link if you're still looking at finding the differences between conservative thought and liberal thought. And 8th graders in class, we will be sure to revisit this not only in our unit on Canada, but as we move throughout our study of the world in looking at different political ideas. So here's another great example of how Europeans have influenced Canadian culture today, and the fact that there are 2 official languages in Canada, and those 2 official languages are English and French. And depending on where you travel in Canada, you're more likely to hear one or the other. For many years, Quebec, which was very much a French-speaking people, wanted their own sovereignty, and they kind of claimed that they had a unique culture as compared to the other provinces and territories of Canada. And they felt that their French majority, which made up about 80%, was threatened with assimilation by the rest of Canada, which tends to be more predominantly English-speaking, but you'll still hear French being spoken outside of Quebec, certainly. And they felt that the best way to preserve that identity and not lose that uniqueness was to essentially become their own nation. They were not able to successfully become sovereign, but certainly they have held on to that French identity and uniqueness as a part of the nation of Canada. Looking at Canada's ethnic groups as part of their cultural elements, we can see that Canada is increasingly becoming more diverse. And these numbers are a little bit older. They're from 2011, but they do kind of help display some very unique growing trends. And you can see that still the majority of people from Canada can trace their lineage from Europe or from having lived in Canada for several generations. And so we can see that there's English and there's French, which would certainly make sense given the history of Canada. But we are also seeing Scottish and Irish and German and Italians. The Chinese are continuing to grow. I would say also not on this list too are other Eastern Asian nations, including Korea as well as Japan. They're starting to see those populations also increase as well in Canada. But you're also seeing First Nation. This would include our native populations, including the Inuit. Ukrainian is certainly on there, East Indian, Dutch, and Polish. So again, certainly still seeing some European influence, but you're also starting to see some growth in the ethnic diversity in Canada. And part of that is the immigration policies that they have put in place. Looking at the religious affiliations, most Canadians are Christian. And we can see here kind of on the chart that we see that there are several followers of both the Roman Catholic Christian faith as well as the Protestant Christian faiths. However, you are still going to see followers from Judaism and Islam as well as Buddhism and Hinduism. And I think you'll see over time that Buddhism and Hinduism will grow, especially as that Eastern Asian influence continues to grow. But you still have a nation that is predominantly Christian at this point, very similar to the United States in that regard as well. All right, getting to some of the uniqueness of Canada. Food is a very unique part of Canadian culture, Montreal-style smoked meats. So if you're a smoked meat fan, Canada is a great place to perhaps travel for, to try different cuisines, especially when it comes to that kind of meat. You might also like pre-meal bacon that we sometimes refer to as Canadian bacon in the United States. Maple syrup, of course, is a very big one. Butter tart pastries. Poutine, for those of you who are French fry fans, these are French fries with gravy and sometimes cheese curds mixed in. A very delicious cuisine that you'll find that's very unique to Canada. Also, you will see French fries covered in like balsamic vinaigrette or vinegar as well, which is also part of that European influence. I know that I had a little bit of that when I was student teaching in Ireland. And of course, Dynamo bars, which are kind of a dessert wafer, also something that is particularly unique to Canada as well. All right, building off of that culture a little bit more, sports are a massive part of Canadian culture. For those of you who are not Winter Olympic fans, Canada is a powerhouse when it comes to hockey, but also just in general, they do very well in the Winter Olympics. Skiing, skating, curling, certainly snowboarding are also big. There's also the Canadian Football League, which has continued to grow in popularity, including competitions over the Grey Cup, which would be like our Super Bowl in American football. But hockey is a big one. Hockey is the national sport. Hockey night in Canada is a very important weekly cultural event. You also, of course, have Canadian teams in the National Hockey League, or the NHL, in the United States as well. And among those heroes certainly would include Wayne Gretzky, Bobby Orr. Several Canadians have had a tremendous influence on the game of hockey. Looking at a global connection for those of you who are from southeastern Minnesota, you'll notice on the screen is Sidney Crosby with the SSM. That's Shattuck St. Mary's, which is a private boarding school in Faribault, Minnesota. So a local connection there. Certainly living in Minnesota right now, I've also begun to experience the importance of hockey, and certainly I'm married to a big hockey fan. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to wrap up our conversation about the culture of Canada. Highly encourage you to take the check-in quiz here for the second section of our Canada unit. 8th graders, use this as kind of a way of checking to see how you're doing. If you kind of picked up on some of the really important concepts here. Again, for the extra credit, come see myself, Mr. B, or Mr. Wilkie, and we'll be happy to create kind of a extra credit or extended learning question for you if you just want to make sure that you're getting the right information. Thank you for checking out the video. 8th graders, please ask any questions that you have in class. Continue to let the learning grow and let it continue. Have a wonderful day.